Hi, I'm Belinda, and welcome to Storytime with Belinda. Here, every story has a heartbeat, and each one is made to connect with you. Whether we're exploring a far off land or talking about something close to home, I hope you find a little piece of yourself in each tale. Let's get started, and thank you for being here. Fairy tales have been a cherished part of childhood for generations. They're enchanting worlds filled with brave heroes, magical beings, and happily ever afters. From Disney's dazzling adaptations to illustrated bedtime story collections, these tales have become synonymous with innocence and wonder. On the surface, they appear to be simple stories meant to entertain and teach young children moral lessons about kindness, courage, and perseverance. But beneath the sparkling veneer lies a far more complex and unsettling truth. The original versions of these stories, often passed down orally long before they were written and sanitized, are anything but lighthearted. They are rife with gruesome violence, betrayal, and psychological terror. Tales that modern audiences associate with love and adventure, such as Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, and Snow White, once carried stark warnings about survival, gender roles, and societal norms. Many of these narratives were crafted to prepare listeners, both children and adults, for the harsh realities of life, from famine and abandonment to the dangers lurking within society. Over time, fairy tales were reshaped and sanitized to align with evolving cultural sensibilities. In the Victorian era, they were cleaned up to fit notions of childhood innocence. The rise of 20th century media, especially Disney films, further polished their grim edges, transforming disturbing tales of mutilation and moral ambiguity into safe, formulaic fantasies. However, understanding the original dark themes of these stories reveals their true intent to confront fears, impart cautionary wisdom, and explore the complexities of human nature. This video delves into the darker side of fairy tales, examining their gruesome origins, the harsh justice they often depict, the rigid gender dynamics they perpetuate, and their psychological and cultural significance. By peeling back the layers of magic and romance, we can uncover the profound and sometimes unsettling lessons these tales have to offer, and why they continue to captivate and haunt us to this day. Fairy tales were never intended solely as delightful bedtime stories for children. Their roots are tangled in oral traditions dating back centuries, originating in a time when life was often brutal and survival depended on wit, strength, and caution. These stories were passed down not only to entertain, but to impart essential life lessons about the dangers lurking in both nature and human society. Beneath the veil of fantastical elements, talking animals, enchanted forests, and magical curses, lay moral warnings that were meant to guide, instruct, and sometimes terrify listeners into compliance. One of the earliest and most enduring functions of fairy tales was to teach lessons about survival. In pre-modern societies, where disease, hunger, and natural disasters were constant threats, children needed to learn from a young age how to navigate a hostile world. Tales such as Hansel and Gretel encapsulated the terror of famine and parental abandonment. In the Grimm original version collected by the Brothers Grimm, the children are deliberately led into the forest by their desperate parents, only to encounter a witch with cannibalistic intentions. The message was clear: beware of strangers, trust your instincts, and rely on your cunning to survive. Similarly, many fairy tales issued stark warnings about the dangers of disobedience. Little Red Riding Hood, one of the most iconic examples, originally portrayed a naive girl who disobeys her mother by straying off the path and consequently falls victim to a predatory wolf. In Charles Perrault's 1697 version, there is no miraculous rescue by a brave woodsman. Red simply gets eaten, an unforgiving punishment for her naivety. Perrault ends the tale with a blunt moral. Young girls should beware smooth-talking strangers, as they are often wolves in disguise. The lesson was unmistakable. Innocence and disobedience were dangerous in a world that offered little mercy. Gender dynamics also played a crucial role in shaping the dark messages of early fairy tales. Women, particularly young girls, were often depicted as passive figures who suffered grave consequences if they failed to conform to societal expectations. In Snow White, the Wicked Queen's obsession with being the fairest of them all serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of vanity and jealousy. Snow White, on the other hand, is portrayed as a virtuous and docile girl who survives only because of her beauty and passivity. The underlying message was clear. Women who step outside their prescribed roles as obedient and modest figures invite destruction upon themselves. Violence and cruelty were also key features of these early stories. The Grimm's version of Cinderella, known as Aschenputtel, is far bloodier than Disney's glittering adaptation. Desperate to fit into the golden slipper, Cinderella's stepsisters mutilate their own feet, slicing off toes and heels to deceive the prince. In the end, justice is meted out when birds peck out the stepsisters' eyes, leaving them blind and ruined. This gruesome conclusion served as a clear warning. Evil and deceit will ultimately be punished, often in the most brutal way imaginable. Fairy tales were not just about warning children. They were also about enforcing social norms and reinforcing the power structures of the time. In many stories, the heroes and heroines succeed by submitting to authority, maintaining virtue, or adhering to rigid gender roles. Those who defied societal expectations, whether out of ambition, curiosity, or sheer will, were often met with grim fates. These narratives reflected the anxieties of a world that valued order, obedience, and tradition over individuality and defiance. In addition to their moral and social lessons, fairy tales also served as outlets for societal fears and anxieties. The monstrous figures that lurked in these tales, witches, wolves, ogres, and dark sorcerers, often embodied the fears of the unknown. Witches, for instance, were frequently depicted as elderly women living on the outskirts of society, reflecting the deep-seated suspicion and misogyny directed toward independent women. These dark characters were used not only to frighten children, but to reinforce societal norms about who was acceptable and who was to be feared. While modern adaptations have softened many of these tales, stripping away much of their darkness and moral ambiguity, their original versions remain deeply unsettling. They are relics of a time when fear was a necessary tool for survival and storytelling was a way to pass on knowledge about life's harsh realities. These tales remind us that darkness has always been a part of the human experience, and that sometimes the scariest monsters are not those in the woods, but the harsh truths we must learn to navigate. Fairy tales are often sanitized in modern retellings, but their original versions were rife with violence, bloodshed, and brutal consequences. These elements were not merely gratuitous, but served as tools for imparting moral lessons and reinforcing societal norms. At their core, These tales used graphic depictions of suffering and punishment to demonstrate the consequences of moral failings, greed, betrayal, or cruelty. Justice in fairy tales was often swift, merciless, and designed to leave a lasting impression on listeners. One of the most infamous examples of twisted justice comes from Cinderella, or Aschenputtel, as it was titled in the Brothers Grimm version. In the sanitized Disney adaptation, Cinderella's stepsisters are humiliated but largely unscathed. However, the original tale is far more brutal. Desperate to marry the prince, the stepsisters mutilate their feet, one slicing off her toe, the other her heel, to fit into the golden slipper. Though they initially deceive the prince, their treachery is exposed when Cinderella's bird companions reveal the bloody truth. In the end, the stepsisters face a grotesque punishment. Birds peck out their eyes, leaving them blinded and forever marked by their deceit. This violent conclusion underscores a harsh moral. Those who are cruel and dishonest will ultimately face ruin. Another tale that vividly illustrates the theme of violent justice is Snow White. The evil queen's obsession with being the fairest of them all drives her to multiple murder attempts, including offering Snow White a poisoned apple. In the Grimm's rendition, the queen meets a chilling fate at Snow White's wedding. She is forced to wear red-hot iron shoes and dance until she collapses and dies. This ghastly punishment serves as a symbolic reckoning for her vanity, jealousy, and murderous intent, reinforcing the idea that evil deeds will be repaid with unimaginable suffering. The tale of the girl without hands presents a particularly grim exploration of violence and justice. In this story, a miller makes a deal with the devil, unwittingly offering his daughter as part of the bargain. When the devil demands that she be kept impure, the father, in a horrifying act, cuts off his daughter's hands to comply. Despite her immense suffering, the girl remains virtuous and eventually finds happiness and restoration through divine intervention and a kind prince. The father, however, is left to grapple with the weight of his betrayal and cruelty. The story's brutal imagery serves as a testament to the resilience of the innocent and the eventual downfall of those who succumb to greed and weakness. Even seemingly light-hearted tales often contained dark elements of punishment. In The Red Shoes, written by Hans Christian Andersen, a young girl named Karen becomes obsessed with a pair of beautiful red shoes. Her vanity and disobedience lead her to wear the shoes to church and dance without permission. The shoes become cursed, forcing her to dance uncontrollably. Desperate to escape the torment, Karen begs an executioner to chop off her feet. The story ends with Karen repenting, but only after enduring severe physical and spiritual suffering. Andersen's tale delivers a stark warning about the dangers of vanity and selfishness, with a level of violence that shocks modern readers. Interestingly, the violence in fairy tales was not always directed at villains alone. Sometimes, innocent characters suffered unimaginable pain as a test of their virtue. In The Little Mermaid, the titular character sacrifices her voice and endures excruciating pain with every step she takes, all for the love of a prince who ultimately marries someone else. Her suffering is portrayed as noble, reinforcing the idea that true love and loyalty are worth immense sacrifice, even if it leads to personal ruin. The graphic nature of these punishments also served a social function. By portraying justice as swift and often brutal, Fairy tales reinforced the idea that societal rules and moral codes were not to be broken. In medieval and early modern Europe, where these stories were often told, justice systems were harsh and public punishments were common. Tales like The Goose Girl, where a deceitful maid is sentenced to be dragged naked through the streets in a barrel lined with nails, mirrored the real-life punishments meted out by authorities. Moreover, these tales often depicted justice as being carried out by supernatural forces, enchanted animals, divine beings, or magical elements, rather than human judges. This reinforced the notion that cosmic justice was inevitable and inescapable, even if earthly justice failed. Such narratives offered a sense of moral order in a world where fairness was often elusive. Despite the grim and graphic nature of these punishments, they played a vital role in the storytelling tradition. They underscored the idea that actions have consequences and that moral failings would not go unpunished. While modern sensibilities may recoil at the sheer brutality depicted in these tales, their original audiences understood these narratives as cautionary lessons designed to instill ethical behavior and social conformity. In stripping away the violence from contemporary versions of fairy tales, we risk losing an essential part of their meaning. The blood-soaked justice in these stories was not just about shocking listeners, it was about reinforcing the values and fears of a society where survival often depended on adherence to strict moral codes. Fairy tales, in their raw and unfiltered forms, remind us that darkness is an integral part of the human experience and that justice, though often cruel, was seen as a necessary force in maintaining order. Fairy tales, though often enchanting and whimsical, have long served as tools for reinforcing societal norms, particularly when it comes to gender roles. Beneath the layers of magic and fantasy lies a framework that often promotes conformity to rigid expectations for men and women. Women, in particular, are frequently cast into roles that revolve around beauty, obedience, and sacrifice, while men are depicted as protectors, saviors, and rulers. These narratives have not only shaped how generations perceive gender roles, but also reinforced societal expectations that continue to influence cultural norms today. At the heart of many fairy tales lies the idealization of feminine beauty and passivity. In stories like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, the heroines are prized primarily for their physical appearance. Snow White's skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony becomes her defining trait, while her kindness and domesticity further cement her as the archetypal ideal woman. Yet these very qualities, beauty and passivity, make her a target for jealousy and violence. She is poisoned by the evil queen, a figure driven by vanity and power, illustrating a clear dichotomy between the good, obedient woman and the bad, ambitious one. The punishment of women who deviate from traditional roles is a recurring theme in these tales. In Bluebeard, a young bride is warned never to enter a forbidden room. Her curiosity, however, drives her to disobey, leading her to discover the gruesome remains of her husband's previous wives. Though she ultimately escapes her murderous husband, the story serves as a cautionary tale about female curiosity and independence. The message is clear: women who seek knowledge or autonomy risk dire consequences. Similarly, in Little Red Riding Hood, the titular character is warned to stay on the path and avoid the dangers of the forest. Her deviation from this instruction leads her straight into the clutches of the predatory wolf. Some early versions of the tale end with Red Riding Hood being devoured, with no savior to rescue her. This grim conclusion underscores the dangers of female disobedience and the belief that young women must be guarded and submissive to avoid peril. Marriage is another dominant theme in fairy tales, often portrayed as the ultimate goal for female characters. In tales like Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, and The Frog Prince, the heroine's happiness is contingent on securing a suitable husband. The act of marriage is depicted as a reward for enduring hardships, abuse, or humiliation. Cinderella's story, for instance, centers on her suffering at the hands of her stepmother and stepsisters. Her patience, humility, and unwavering goodness eventually lead to her, happily ever after, when she marries the prince. The implicit message is that women must endure trials without complaint to be deemed worthy of love and security. However, even in tales where women exhibit agency, their actions are often framed within the context of serving male desires or conforming to societal expectations. In Beauty and the Beast, Beauty sacrifices her freedom to save her father and later redeems the Beast through her love and compassion. While this can be read as a tale of redemption and transformation, it also reinforces the idea that a woman's role is to nurture and reform the men around her. Male characters, on the other hand, are frequently depicted as brave, strong, and resourceful. Princes and heroes are tasked with slaying dragons, rescuing damsels, and restoring order to their kingdoms. The archetypal male hero, such as the valiant prince in Sleeping Beauty, represents the societal ideal of masculinity, courageous, protective, and dominant. Even when flawed, these male characters are often forgiven and celebrated for their strength and assertiveness. Yet, the pressure to conform to these rigid roles can also be stifling for men. The expectation to be fearless and dominant leaves little room for vulnerability or emotional complexity. In some cases, male characters who exhibit gentleness or empathy, such as the Beast in Beauty and the Beast, are only redeemed when they embrace their true, noble, and authoritative identities. Despite these entrenched gender norms, some fairy tales subvert traditional roles and offer more progressive narratives. The tale of Vasilisa the Beautiful from Russian folklore features a clever and resourceful heroine who outwits the fearsome witch Baba Yaga with the help of her magical doll. Similarly, The 12 Dancing Princesses portrays a group of independent princesses who secretly escape their palace every night to dance in an enchanted underground realm. These stories suggest that, even within the confines of traditional fairy tales, there are glimpses of female empowerment and autonomy. Modern reinterpretations of fairy tales have also challenged these gender dynamics, offering new perspectives on classic narratives. Authors like Angela Carter, in her collection The Bloody Chamber, reimagined traditional tales to highlight female agency, desire, and resistance. Contemporary films such as Frozen and Maleficent have shifted the focus from romantic love to themes of sisterhood, independence, and the complexity of female characters. The enduring popularity of fairy tales speaks to their deep-rooted influence on culture and identity. By examining the gender dynamics within these stories, we gain insight into the societal values they perpetuate and the ways in which they can be reimagined to reflect more inclusive and empowering narratives. While traditional fairy tales often reinforce conformity to strict gender roles, Their malleable nature offers the potential for transformation and the opportunity to tell stories that celebrate individuality, equality, and the breaking of outdated norms. Fairy tales have captivated audiences for centuries not merely because of their enchanting narratives, but due to their profound psychological and cultural resonance. These stories, often filled with fantastical elements and archetypal characters, tap into the collective unconscious, offering insight into the human psyche and societal norms. Through their symbolic language, fairy tales reflect universal fears, desires, and moral dilemmas, making them timeless tools for understanding both the individual and society at large. Carl Jung, a pioneer in analytical psychology, viewed fairy tales as manifestations of the collective unconscious, a shared reservoir of human experience and symbolic patterns. According to Jung, the recurring themes and characters in fairy tales represent archetypes, or universal symbols, that appear across cultures and time periods. These include figures such as the hero, the wise old man, the trickster, and the shadow. Take, for example, the archetype of the hero in tales like Jack and the Beanstalk or the 12 Labors of Hercules. The hero's journey, characterized by trials, transformation, and eventual triumph, mirrors the psychological journey of personal growth and self-discovery. Similarly, the wicked stepmother in Snow White or Cinderella embodies the shadow archetype, a representation of repressed fears, negative traits, or societal taboos. The presence of these archetypes in fairy tales provides readers with a framework to navigate their inner worlds. By identifying with the protagonist's struggles and victories, individuals can confront their own fears, overcome obstacles, and gain a deeper understanding of themselves. Sigmund Freud offered another psychological lens through which to interpret fairy tales. He believed that these stories often reflect unconscious desires, fears, and anxieties rooted in early childhood experiences. Fairy tales, with their exaggerated characters and dramatic plot lines, can be seen as symbolic representations of repressed emotions and conflicts. Freud's interpretation of Little Red Riding Hood, for instance, suggests that the tale explores themes of sexual awakening and danger. The red cloak, a symbol of menstruation and maturation, combined with the wolf's predatory behavior, creates a narrative about the perils of emerging womanhood. Likewise, the recurring theme of parental abandonment in tales like Hansel and Gretel or the juniper tree may reflect childhood anxieties about separation and the loss of parental protection. The use of violence and transformation in fairy tales can also be interpreted through a Freudian lens. The graphic punishments meted out to villains, such as the evil queen in Snow White, may serve as cathartic outlets for repressed aggression and desires for justice. By presenting these intense emotions in a fantastical context, fairy tales provide a safe space for readers to confront and process their unconscious fears. Fairy tales are not only psychological mirrors, but also cultural artifacts that reflect the values, norms, and anxieties of the societies in which they were created. As oral traditions passed down through generations, these stories were often adapted to address contemporary social issues and to reinforce community morals. In pre-industrial Europe, for example, fairy tales often served as cautionary tales for children, warning them of the dangers lurking in the wild or the consequences of disobedience. Hansel and Gretel, with its depiction of children abandoned in a forest, reflects societal fears of famine and resource scarcity, common concerns during times of economic hardship. Gender roles are another area where cultural values are prominently displayed. As discussed earlier, traditional fairy tales often reinforced patriarchal norms, portraying women as passive, beautiful, and nurturing while depicting men as brave protectors and providers. These narratives help to instill and perpetuate societal expectations for gender behavior. However, fairy tales have also been sites of cultural resistance and transformation. In some indigenous traditions, storytelling served as a way to preserve cultural identity and pass down knowledge in the face of colonization and assimilation. Stories of trickster figures, such as Anansi from West African folklore or Coyote from Native American tales, often challenge authority and subvert societal norms, offering a counter-narrative to dominant cultural values. However, fairy tales have also been sites of cultural resistance and transformation. In some indigenous traditions, storytelling served as a way to preserve cultural identity and pass down knowledge in the face of colonization and assimilation. Stories of trickster figures, such as Anansi from West African folklore or Coyote from Native American tales, often challenge authority and subvert societal norms, offering a counter-narrative to dominant cultural values. As society has evolved, so too have interpretations of fairy tales. The feminist movement of the 20th century sparked a wave of criticism and reinterpretation of traditional fairy tale narratives. Scholars like Marina Warner and Angela Carter challenged the passive depictions of female characters and highlighted the underlying themes of power, sexuality, and autonomy in these stories. Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, a collection of reimagined fairy tales, subverts traditional narratives by giving voice and agency to female characters. In her retelling of Bluebeard, the heroine is not a helpless victim but a resourceful and empowered woman who ultimately saves herself. Such reinterpretations have paved the way for contemporary adaptations that celebrate diversity, agency, and inclusivity. Films like Disney's Frozen and Brave reflect this cultural shift, moving away from the traditional damsel in distress trope and focusing instead on themes of sisterhood, self-discovery, and courage. These modern interpretations challenge outdated norms and offer new narratives that better align with contemporary values. At the same time, the rise of psychological horror and dark fantasy in literature and media has brought a renewed interest in the darker aspects of fairy tales. Stories like Neil Gaiman's Coraline and Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth explore themes of fear, courage, and identity through a fairy tale lens, blending psychological depth with cultural commentary. The enduring power of fairy tales lies in their ability to balance darkness and light, fear and hope. They speak to our deepest anxieties while offering pathways to healing and redemption. By examining these stories through psychological and cultural lenses, we gain a richer understanding of their complexities and their ongoing relevance in our lives. In an age where narratives continue to shape our perceptions of identity, morality, and possibility, fairy tales remain a vital part of the cultural fabric. Their ability to evolve and adapt ensures that they will continue to captivate, challenge, and inspire generations to come. Over the centuries, fairy tales have undergone significant transformations. Originally dark, violent, and filled with cautionary lessons, these stories were often sanitized to suit changing societal values and expectations. Modern reinterpretations have further reshaped the narratives, reflecting contemporary ideals and serving as vehicles for social commentary. This evolution reveals not only the adaptability of fairy tales, but also the shifting cultural landscape they inhabit. The first major shift in fairy tales occurred during the transition from oral tradition to written literature. The Brothers Grimm, known for collecting and publishing many now classic tales, initially documented raw and unfiltered stories from German folklore. These early versions were filled with brutal punishments, dark magic, and moral ambiguities. For example, in the original version of Snow White, the Wicked Queen is forced to wear red-hot iron shoes and dance until she dies. Similarly, Hansel and Gretel depicts parents who abandon their children due to famine, a grim reflection of real societal fears. Despite their initial focus on preserving the authenticity of folklore, the Grimms later revised their collections to align with the moral and religious values of 19th century society. Subsequent editions of Grimm's fairy tales toned down the violence, emphasized Christian virtues, and often reinforced traditional gender roles. Mothers who were once portrayed as cruel figures were recast as stepmothers, preserving the sanctity of the maternal image. These changes made the stories more palatable to middle-class families and more suitable for children. The Victorian era saw further sanitization of fairy tales as they became firmly embedded in children's literature. Writers such as Hans Christian Andersen and publishers like Andrew Lang emphasized moral lessons and proper behavior in their collections. Andersen's The Little Mermaid, for instance, was less concerned with the mermaid's desires and more focused on her spiritual redemption through suffering and sacrifice. During this period, fairy tales became tools for social conditioning. Young girls were encouraged to emulate the patience and passivity of characters like Cinderella, while boys were expected to be brave and adventurous like Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk. The sanitization of these tales served to reinforce Victorian ideals of femininity, morality, and obedience. The most significant modern transformation of fairy tales came with the advent of Disney. Walt Disney's animated films, beginning with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, revolutionized how fairy tales were consumed and understood by the public. These films emphasized romance, happy endings, and visually stunning fantasy worlds, leaving behind much of the darkness and complexity of the original tales. While Disney's adaptations introduced fairy tales to a global audience, they also further sanitized the narratives. The grim punishments for villains were replaced by humorous comeuppances or simple banishment. Complex characters were flattened into clear-cut heroes and villains, and female protagonists were often depicted as passive damsels waiting for their princes. Critics have argued that the Disneyfication of fairy tales diluted their psychological and moral complexity, turning them into escapist fantasies rather than reflective moral allegories. However, Disney's influence cannot be understated. Its adaptations became the definitive versions of many fairy tales for generations of children. In response to the sanitized narratives popularized by Disney, the late 20th and early 21st centuries saw a surge in subversive retellings of traditional fairy tales. Feminist writers and scholars, such as Angela Carter, sought to reclaim these stories and highlight their underlying themes of female agency, power, and sexuality. Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber reimagines classic tales with a dark and feminist twist. Her version of Bluebeard portrays the heroine as a resourceful woman who ultimately saves herself rather than relying on a male rescuer. Similarly, in her retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, the protagonist confronts the wolf without fear, symbolizing female empowerment and sexual liberation. This wave of reinterpretations also extended to film and television. Productions like Into the Woods, Maleficent, and Once Upon a Time presented complex characters and questioned traditional notions of good and evil. These modern adaptations often explored the motivations of so-called villains, blurring the line between hero and antagonist. Alongside feminist reinterpretations, there has been a renewed interest in the darker aspects of fairy tales. Writers like Neil Gaiman and filmmakers such as Guillermo del Toro have embraced the psychological horror inherent in these stories, crafting narratives that are both haunting and thought-provoking. Gaiman's Coraline, for instance, draws heavily on fairy tale motifs but infuses them with a nightmarish quality. The story follows a young girl who discovers a parallel world where everything seems perfect until it turns sinister. Similarly, Del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth weaves fairy tale elements into a dark fantasy set against the backdrop of post-Civil War Spain, exploring themes of innocence, brutality, and courage. These darker reinterpretations resonate with contemporary audiences who are increasingly drawn to narratives that reflect the complexities and uncertainties of the modern world. They offer a space to confront fears and anxieties in a fantastical, yet meaningful context. As societal values continue to evolve, so too do fairy tales. Recent adaptations have sought to include diverse voices and perspectives, moving away from Eurocentric narratives. Writers and filmmakers are increasingly exploring folklore from non-Western cultures, bringing fresh perspectives to the genre. For example, the animated film Moana draws on Polynesian mythology, while novels like Tommy Adeyemi's Children of Blood and Bone are inspired by West African folklore. These stories not only celebrate cultural diversity, but also challenge the dominance of traditional Western fairy tale tropes. Inclusivity also extends to representations of gender and sexuality. Tales are being reimagined to feature LGBTQ+ characters and non-binary protagonists, reflecting the diversity of modern audiences. These adaptations challenge outdated notions of identity and create more inclusive narratives that resonate with a broader range of readers and viewers. Despite their many transformations, fairy tales remain a vital part of human storytelling. Their ability to adapt to changing cultural contexts while retaining their core themes of love, courage, and morality is a testament to their enduring power. As society continues to evolve, so too will these stories, reflecting the hopes, fears, and values of each new generation. Ultimately, the evolution of fairy tales illustrates their dual nature. They are both products of their time and timeless narratives that speak to the human condition. Whether in their original grim forms, sanitized Disney adaptations, or modern feminist reinterpretations, fairy tales will continue to enchant, challenge, and inspire audiences for generations to come. Fairy tales, in their raw and unfiltered forms, are much more than simple bedtime stories. They are profound reflections of human fears, desires, and moral struggles. By examining their darker elements, the violence, psychological trauma, and societal expectations embedded within them, we gain insight into the complexities of life and the timeless lessons these stories were intended to convey. Rather than dismissing or sanitizing these narratives, we should learn to embrace their unsettling truths and appreciate the value they hold in navigating our own experiences. The enduring appeal of fairy tales lies in their ability to speak to the duality of human existence, light and darkness, joy and suffering, innocence and corruption. These stories were never meant to present a picture-perfect world, but rather to confront the harsh realities of life through symbolic narratives. By grappling with themes of betrayal, death, fear, and redemption, they offer a safe space for readers to confront their own anxieties and find resilience in the face of adversity. Modern reinterpretations that reintroduce or reinterpret the grim elements of fairy tales play an essential role in preserving their cultural significance. When authors, filmmakers, and artists peel back the sanitized layers imposed by centuries of censorship, they reveal tales that resonate on a deeper, more authentic level. This reclamation of darkness does not glorify pain or suffering but acknowledges them as essential components of the human experience. Moreover, the resurgence of interest in the psychological and cultural interpretations of fairy tales offers a therapeutic dimension. These tales are no longer confined to entertainment or moral instruction. They have become tools for self-reflection and healing. The symbolic journeys of characters like Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, or Beauty are, in essence, representations of the trials we all face. They remind us that transformation often requires confronting darkness head-on, and that even in the bleakest circumstances, hope and triumph are possible. In an era where media often presents polished, idealized versions of life, embracing the darker truths of fairy tales becomes a subversive yet necessary act. These stories challenge us to confront uncomfortable truths, reject the superficial veneer of perfection, and acknowledge the messy, complex realities of existence. They remind us that the path to happiness is often fraught with peril and that true strength lies in perseverance and courage. Ultimately, fairy tales are a mirror to society, reflecting its hopes, fears, and evolving values. By accepting their dark origins and complex narratives, we honor their timeless role as moral compasses, cultural artifacts, and psychological touchstones. They encourage us not to shy away from life's challenges, but to face them with the same courage as their enduring heroes and heroines. The dark truths within fairy tales are not something to be feared but embraced, for they illuminate the path to understanding, growth, and resilience. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I hope you had as much fun as I did. If you love this one, make sure to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new tale. Got a story idea? Drop it in the comments below. I'm always looking for new adventures to share. Until next time, stay curious and keep telling your own stories.